Okay.
How much did you curve this test?
I ended up curving this test by 7. So I know I add the 7 to whatever you got as your score and then take it out of 61. So I copy your grades into the Excel spreadsheet, add 7, figure them out, put them back in Springboard. And so I think if you go to quizzes, you can look at what your original score is, and then in grades you can look at what your adjusted score is. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So I did end up throwing out 7 questions from exam 3. There were 2 of them that had pictures that didn't show up, so I apologize for that. I don't know what happened. The grades for this exam were much better, so that's awesome. And also in the content section, or in the news section, I put an Excel spreadsheet so that you can figure out your grades, and if some of you need to figure out that you need a certain grade to pass, or to get a C, or to get an A, or whatever it is that you need, that's in the news section of Springboard, and also how to figure your points out, because it says on Springboard, if you go into grades, that there's 120 points from, or 140 points from, I suppose I could just look at this. So I'm not going to pull open grades because that would show you somebody's grades, and that's not cool. So if you go to grades, it shows that there's 140 possible points, but since 2 of those were makeup, there was one that was the storm of the century, another one that said makeup, so I only counted it out of 120 points. And so you take however many you had, if you have 90 points total, and you divide it by 120, that'll give you what your percentage is, and then you can put that into the Excel spreadsheet, and if you have further questions about that, I can definitely help you on that. So if you didn't see the first slide, the end of the semester is going to be chapters 14, 15, and 16. This is the ecology section, and that's going to be what will be on your final. If any of you are taking the makeup exam, it's the comprehensive final. It'll be chapters 1, 2, and 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 14, 15, 16. So that's the comprehensive final. But if you're just taking the regular final, it's just going to be these 3 chapters. So if you're starting to think about how your grades are set up, remember we have 4 exams for this course, so that's 60% of your grade. Then your lab grade is 25%, and your homework grade is 15%. So hopefully the homeworks in the lab bring up your grades. I know that that usually is true for most students, and if you have any further questions, let me know. So getting into chapter 14, we're going to be talking a little bit about population ecology, which is basically not just that we're looking at individuals. Of course, we look at the DNA makeup of individuals and how their chromosomes and genes come to form their traits, but looking more about how these different things are going to work together. So the basic definition of population ecology is that it is the study of how populations interact with their environment. Because it's never usually helpful to just study one organism. You want to study the whole population and how it works out in the environment, because that'll give you a good idea. Things never really work in the lab the same way that they work out in nature, and so that's one of the reasons it's really cool to work in biology, because then you get to go cool places and see cool nature. So in looking at ecology, we look at this as a case study in ecology. This is the one that's described in your book about the lobsters off the coast of Maine. So if you are an ecologist and you're wanting to understand the population ecology of the lobsters out in Maine, because you're interested in how fishermen go out and fish for lobsters, or how lobsters are supported by that environment, or how pollution affects them, or overfishing affects them. Ecology is a study of how all of these things work together. So if we are asking some questions about this population of lobsters that lives off the coast of Maine, the first thing we might ask is, well, if you're going to go out and fish for them, how many do you allow each fisherman to take per day? Or how many do you allow them to take per year? If you allow it per day, is there certain seasons that are involved? If you do it after mating season or after spawning season, is that going to be different than if you allow just a company to take a certain amount per year? Should you require that a certain sized lobster be thrown back? If so, do you throw back only the small ones, or do you throw back only the big ones that are capable of producing offspring? Does it matter if you throw back males or if you throw back females? Then we might also go on to ask, how do you maintain this population size at its current level? Is there something we can do artificially to increase the numbers? Is there a certain season that the numbers increase? Is there a dying season, a breeding season? But you start to notice that this becomes increasingly complex as we start to ask questions. One simple question always kind of steamrolls into more and more questions that get into, how can we ever really figure out how many lobsters are living off the coast of Maine? Because obviously the ocean is a big open area and things can come and go. So can we estimate that? Can we count exactly how many lobsters are there? So could we even have a clue of what's going on? And so this is basically what ecology is. It's coming up with all of these complex questions that then lead to more questions that then go back to other questions. And so it's almost kind of mind-numbing to think that you can't ever really know the answers to these. So if we're looking at this population of lobsters, we first start off with the individual organisms. So one lobster is an individual organism. Then as we start to get into many lobsters that are a breeding population, we have these groups of individuals that are going to breed with one another. So all the organisms that are the same species. So same species of lobster, they're capable of breeding, so they're in the same place at the same time. Then as we get even more complex, we can look at the communities. Lobsters don't live only by themselves off the shore of Maine. You also have fish, which will affect the number of lobsters. Fish sometimes eat lobsters. They can suck up the eggs. They can affect the lobster populations with their poop. We can look at the clams. We can look at the invertebrates. All of these different things that are within a given area at a given time that are interacting together with one another. So multiple species. And then looking at the ecosystem, we look at things like climate, water temperature, water clarity, looking at pollution, looking at the minerals and the different types of rocks, the different types of dissolved gases in the water. So all the living organisms as well as the non-living elements that interact together in a particular area. So you start to see how complex this gets, and it gets complex very fast. If we look at this with humans, we can see the same thing with humans. One individual human, we live in a population of humans where we could all interbreed theoretically. There's lots of other species out there that affect humans. There's the food that we eat. There's things that could prey on us, including like bacteria and viruses. And then if we look at the non-living things that affect humans, the climate affects us, the water, the air that we're breathing in, and then different things that are going on all around us. So ecology is incredibly complex. It just happens at so many different levels that you always have to be thinking about what is this balance, or what is this one thing that can affect the other thing. And so scientists who are ecologists go out and study how these interactions work together. So if I were to ask you a question like this on your test, in your own neighborhood, which list below defines a biological community? Take a minute to look through that and see which one defines community. Okay, so as you're finishing up reading that, what's the consensus? Okay, so if you look back here, you can see a community is a population of different species that interact in a location at a time. So the answer to that one would be 3. So animals, including humans, as well as the plants. I think we tend to leave out plants very often in talking about things that are alive in a certain given area at a certain time. So make sure that if you're thinking about a community, you're not just thinking about the animals, you're also thinking about the plants. And then moving up, if you looked at the ecosystem, you would have number 4, which is animal, plants, and the physical environment. So this is kind of a funny picture because you never really think about giraffes as a population and moving in a herd. So here we have a herd of giraffes. Notice that it's kind of hard to distinguish one organism from the other in a population because they all look so similar. They all have similar characteristics. And so in looking at the population ecology, we can examine features that are not just happening in one individual giraffe. If we were going to break down an individual giraffe and look at the DNA and the chromosomes and the traits, looking at a population is going to give us the averages of all of those things. Not just individual organisms, but the population, the group of interbreeding organisms. And also, you always have to keep in mind that the size of the herd or the size of the population does affect the way that they interact with one another. So when you think of one giraffe in a zoo, it's going to be much different than 100 giraffes in a herd. So in talking about different types of populations, we can look at the stable populations. So if we ask a question along the lines of how many of the 5 million eggs that a female cod might lay over the course of her life will, on average, survive and grow to adulthood. So if we think about one cod, one fish that's living in a stream, she may lay 5 million eggs over the course of her lifetime, but only maybe 5 or 6 will make it to adulthood because eggs are very easily consumed by predators in the ecosystem. And then as they start to grow up into little minnows and they start to get a little bit bigger, they will be consumed. They're like the popcorn bucket of the stream. They're so easy to catch. And so of the 5 million eggs, like I said, maybe 5 or 6 are going to be making it to be full-sized adults. We might also ask certain questions like, who would leave more surviving offspring, a pair of elephants or a pair of rabbits? So if we think about how we eventually get down to a breeding pair of rabbits, of course there are going to be a lot more rabbits that are going to be born and a lot more rabbits that are going to die than there will be elephants, or if we moved on up to the human population, there's going to be only so many humans replacing the generation of humans that come before them. So in a stable population, what we're basically looking to do is to replace the male and the female of the population. So if a male and a female are breeding together, they're going to hope that a male and a female are going to make it to adulthood. That's what makes for a stable population, is one that neither you have lots and lots of rabbits survive and the population goes up, nor do you have the population dwindling as you would see it as species go extinct. So stable population means basically a 1-to-1 replacement ratio. If you start to see something along the lines of exponential growth is when you see this the breeding starting to take place and the numbers start to go up and up and up, and they're just exploding out of control. So if you think about human species over time, which is one of the laboratories that we'll do coming up here, I believe, next week, in exponential growth of humans, the human population has maintained this relatively stable, slightly upward growth curve until you start to get into about the 1920s and 1930s, where we had industrial revolution, we had the growth of agriculture, we had medicines and sanitation, and then you just see the number of humans just skyrocket. And it's been going almost straight up. So at a certain point, that population is going to stop growing because either they'll reach what's called carrying capacity, which we'll talk about here in the next couple of slides. But exponential growth is basically this shooting upwards of the population of this certain species. So the example that they give here is I think it's a moose, or it's elk. So exponential growth occurs when individuals produce more than a single offspring necessary to replace itself. So as a human, I have one child. That child is going to replace me. In this case, you might see a population of 500 elk, and then with this way that they can move out and migrate and all this excess food that's available, if you were to let the elk population just grow out of control, within 80 years there could be 1 billion individuals and they could cover the entire earth. Now, obviously that isn't going to happen, because if we were to have 1 billion elk out there, that would change the number of other species that would be found around the globe. You wouldn't be able to feed 1 billion elk, just like at some point we're going to reach the carrying capacity of the number of humans here on Earth. And if you have too many humans, you don't have enough Earth to sustain them. So we see these fluctuations that happen in nature, and this is just a natural part of the way that populations ebb and flow or increase and decline. So here's that hand movement that I did, the exponential growth. So if we were to look at elk, and in year 1 there are 500 elk, if in year 5 we have 1,037 elk, we have doubled the population plus a little bit. Then if you look 10 years from now, that population has more than doubled again. 25 years, 50 years go by. Eventually, the doubling of the population is going to have to stop because nature cannot support it. So that's when you start to see things like starvation. That was very common among the deer populations that I saw in Texas. I don't know if I told you guys at the beginning, but when I used to live in Texas, I lived on a 180,000-acre hunting ranch, and if you didn't go out and kill off some of the deer in order to bring the population down, then they would double, and eventually they would start starving, and as they started to starve, they would move out into populated areas where there were humans, and people would start hitting them with their cars, and you would see starving deer dying on the side of the road, and it was really pretty tragic. It was kind of horrible to watch. So sustainable hunting is something that I, as a biologist, am actually in favor of. And so a population's growth is going to be limited by its environment. Those elk cannot go out and reach every corner of the globe. Yes, the globe is spherical, but they can't go out. What happens when they reach the ocean? The elk are not going to swim. So population's growth is going to be limited by its environment, because it's only going to live in a specific population, or in a specific area at a specific time. And as it starts to move into other areas, it can be killed, it can starve, it cannot have the proper environment that it needs to raise its young in. So populations never just grow unchecked. If you look at things, there are two different types of factors we'll talk about here. There's density-dependent factors and density-independent factors. So you kind of have to break down what that terminology means. So in density-dependent, something that depends on how dense the population is, we look at things like food supply. If there is not enough food to support a population, then some of that population is going to die off, because there is going to be a natural competition that you see between predators and between grazers out there in nature. There's only a limited food supply to feed this population. So it depends on how dense the population is. The habitat for living and breeding, you've probably seen all kinds of discovery documentaries where they have the males that are fighting each other in order to have the territory over the females, or you see the lion that's the king of his pack and he has all the females around them. There's only a certain amount of habitat to go around, and if you start to cross over those habitats, that's when you're going to start to see fighting and predation occurring and them fighting for territory. Parasites and disease risk, when you start to get upwards in population, as we have even seen just in humans, the more humans you get in a little area, the more chance you have of them spreading viruses around, spreading bacteria around. Same thing happens out in nature with parasites. The more the populations overlap, the more you start to see parasites going around, and the more you start to see this predation risk. So this is where you get to the harsh understanding that nature is not kind. Nature is deadly. Things fight over food. Things fight over habitat. They start to die off because of disease. They start to die off because other things eat them. But this is all depending on how dense the population is in a given area at a given time. So beyond density-dependent factors, we have our density, let me go first to density, crap. Okay, let me go back. Okay, density-dependent factors. The limitations on the population's growth are a consequence of the population density. So how many individuals we have over a given space in a given time reaches what is called carrying capacity. We sometimes abbreviate that by the letter K. We call it carrying capacity of the environment. The environment can only support a certain number of consumers, a certain number of producers, a certain number of species, a certain amount of that population in that given area at that given time. So that depends on how dense the population is going to be. So make sure that you know the four factors that go along with that, and that carrying capacity is K of the environment. So when we look at carrying capacity, we look at logistic growth. What that basically means is if you look at the way the graph is set up here, we've got the period of time along the bottom and the population size as it's moving up. So anytime you have a population, they're going to be steadily increasing. And as that exponential growth starts to go up, they're going to reach carrying capacity, which means that that given area at that given time cannot support any more organisms than it is currently supporting. So that carrying capacity is going to shut off any of the population from going through exponential straight-up growth because you cannot grow a population forever, or it could overrun the entire Earth. So it's going to start to gradually taper off as it reaches the carrying capacity, and it never just goes in a straight line. Sometimes it shoots up over carrying capacity and then it goes back down, and then it shoots back up and it goes back down. We often see that happening along with another individual, like predators and prey. So if you have a certain number of rabbits, you'll also be able to support a certain number of foxes. If there's 1 year there's an explosion of rabbits, then the foxes have plenty to eat, so there's an explosion of foxes. Then there's not enough rabbits to feed those foxes, and the foxes start to starve, so it goes back down. So it basically goes up and goes down. It ebbs and flows. So if you were to look at this graph right here, what is the carrying capacity of the environment for this population in this graph? So if I were to give you this as a test question, what does it look like the population size carrying capacity is? Yes, it'd be the 6,000. Because you can see right where it becomes almost a straight line, that's going to be the carrying capacity. There'll be the little fluctuations, but this is just a simple graph. And so Like I just talked about with the number of deer in Texas, many states, including Ohio, have a problem with increasing deer populations. So if I were to ask you on your test, how could we decrease the growth of the deer population? Take a look at those and tell me which one would cause a decrease in the growth of the population. Okay, so let's try and kind of reason through this. If we were to increase the number of natural predators in the state, let's say we went out and we released 10 coyotes, would that bring the number of deer population down? Yes. So if we were to provide a better habitat for the deer, would that make the population go down? No. If we were to provide a better population, that would make if we were providing a better habitat, that would make the population go up. If you were to limit the number of deer taken during a hunting season, would that make the deer population go down? No. If you limit it, it makes the population go back up. That's what they do when there are not enough deer around. They limit the number of deer taken during a hunting season. So the only way to really bring the deer population down, besides like the really cruel ways of like killing off their babies or doing something horrible to deer, would be to release their natural predators, and that would make the numbers go down. Okay, so that was density dependent. Now we get into density independent forces. These are things that are going to strike and kill off populations despite how big they are. So these are mostly going to be weather-related items. If you think about things that would be bad luck for a population, if a fire comes and tears through a rainforest or tears through a forest, that's going to kill all the rabbits despite whether there's a million rabbits or whether there's 1,000 rabbits. So if the fire destroys the entire forest, all of them will die. Doesn't matter how many there are. If there's an earthquake, that can devastate populations. It doesn't matter how many are there, the earthquake is going to happen anyways. Things like lightning, things like floods. If you look at what just happened in Hurricane Sandy, or if you think back to the tsunamis that have happened, where they've come through and the tidal wave crashes up onto the land, it doesn't matter if there's 1,000 people there or 1,000,000 people there. It's still going to have the same destructive force. So something that is density independent happens despite the size of the population. And so it strikes the population without regard for the size. So think of all the really bad weather-related things that could happen, and those are things that happen despite whatever size there are. So if we move on, we start to think less about the animals in a population and think more about how this affects the people that are here on Earth. As you guys may have known, we recently hit the 7 billion people mark, and it used to be that we never could have supported 7 billion people, but now that we have proper medicine, now that we have agriculture, now that we have sanitation, like there's not rivers of bathroom mess moving down the streets, spreading disease. The number of people that the Earth can support keeps going up. And it's going to keep going up until we get to the point where people are starving because there's no more food to support those people. So development of the agricultural technologies has been one of the ways that the carrying capacity of the Earth has been increased. So as we were slowly moving up, and now as we're starting to shoot up, we can support more and more people because we can produce more and more food. So think about the things that have helped us to produce more and more food. If you look at the hybrid varieties of corn, so corn that is producing bigger kernels and more ears of corn per square acre, as we start to look at these rich fertilizers and artificial fertilizers that can make us have better, bigger crops. looking at crop rotation so that we have higher yield of crops per square acre, and then us being able to manage pests, herbicides, insecticides, pesticides. We are able to produce more and more food in less and less space. So that allows more and more humans to occupy more and more spaces. But there is some point that we're going to reach where the Earth cannot support any more humans. So if you think back to maybe your childhood where we talked about exploring other planets and seeing if we could build greenhouses in outer space where we could make our food, and being able to send humans elsewhere into space, that had better happen, or the Earth is going to at some point say no more humans because we can't feed any more of you. So like I had said, with your carrying capacity, sometimes you go right over it and then you go back down. Sometimes it goes up and sometimes it goes back down. So we see population cycling occur. This was one of the interesting stories that I read about, and I believe that this is explained further in your book. There was a place in southern Asia and northeast Africa where usually locusts, those big like grasshopper flying locusts, usually they live as isolated individuals in a given space. But due to the way that the rainy season hit, these locusts actually became really condensed over a small place, and they started to explode in their numbers. So much so that they started acting as a mob. If you think back to like the biblical references to the swarm of locusts, this is what basically happened. And so there is natural ways to support this swarm of locusts actually happening. And they started to move around, and they would settle down on some crops, eat all the crops, reproduce, and then they would all pick up and move to another area and destroy that whole area, and then move on to the next area. And because of the way the weather patterns occurred, and because of the climate, these locusts went from individuals to acting as a mob. I suppose you can probably think of this occurring in humans too, where one individual human is not very likely to act badly, but if you get a bunch of people acting together as a mob, you see them acting badly when they're together. Same thing happens, not exactly understood by biologists. They try and understand this the best way that they can, but it's impossible to reproduce. We're usually going in and studying things that happen after the fact, but the things that lead up to these different huge events are really quite fascinating. Here we have another one where, just like we talked about the up and down over the carrying capacity, what the terminology for that is called is population oscillation. So here we have a lynx and a snowshoe hare, and so you can see the population of the snowshoe hare starts to go up, and as it goes up, it supports more lynx. And so more lynx eat off more rabbits, and then as the population of the rabbits, I say rabbits, they're snowshoe hares. As the hares go back down, then the lynx starts to go back down as they die off from starvation. And then as they die off and they're not predators anymore, the population of the hares goes back up. So you can see that they're moving up and down together in this oscillation. And this is what we see so often in nature, is that when one thing goes up, the other thing goes up, and as one thing goes down, the other thing goes down. So it's all about predators and predation. It's about food and then being eaten. And you can watch these happen in nature lots, especially when we throw in environmental factors such as climate. We throw in droughts or rainy seasons. We throw in forest fires or things that go in and devastate populations. It's really interesting to see how they go up and go down. So which of these population oscillations would you expect to happen? If you look at this question here, which you would expect population oscillations in which one of these examples? What do you think? Okay, that seems to be the one that I keep picking over and over. So you have small, sorry, make them all number 3. That's awesome. The population of small mammals and their predators are going to increase and decrease over time, and they happen together. So one of the things that we attempt to do as scientists, as lovers of nature, and as we hope that we're going to be able to support more and more people over time, is that scientists attempt to manage natural resources. So they look at things like effectiveness. You probably have heard of sustainability. That's a big talk right now in college campuses about sustainable living, and can you be sustained on your current levels of consumption. And so we look at the natural resources out there. A great example of this is logging. If we cut down all of these trees and it takes so long for the trees to grow back, if we cut down more trees than we're able to grow back, eventually we're going to have completely deforested, wiped out the population of trees. And since they take so long to grow back, there's not enough of them in their lifetimes. And so if we don't watch how we utilize natural resources, we can actually cause them to go extinct, as we have seen so often happen in nature, because we don't really think of our actions as having counteractions. We don't really think that as we go out and destroy all the logs in the forest, we may also be destroying other natural resources that go along with them, like the deer population, the rabbit population, maybe a bacterial population that's important that reaches out beyond that. So populations are really important to understand within the context of the environment, within the context of their ecology. So one of the things that is interesting about our jobs is that virtually every natural resource manager fails to do their job because their jobs can never exactly be defined within context. Can I ever actually know how many lobsters are in the bay in Maine in a given time? There's no way that I can pinpoint it down to the number that are actually there. When I lived in Texas, there was no way for me to actually go out and track how many deer there were per square acre or per square mile on that ranch. And so it's because of fluctuations. It's the same reason we can never really tell how many humans there are here on Earth at any given time, because humans are constantly having babies and constantly dying off. And so sometimes that number moves up, sometimes it moves back down. And then it moves up a little higher, and then it moves back down, and then up a little higher. So we see these ebbs and flows. So the maximum sustainable yield is a useful concept, but it's difficult to put into practice, because it's hard to tell exactly how many or exactly what a population size is over any given area or at any given time, because that number is constantly fluctuating and there's no way to actually know. And so I'm going to leave you guys off with that at this point, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I'll see you next Tuesday. There'll be no assignment online, so enjoy yourself, eat lots of turkey, and all that good stuff.